former Viet Cong squad leader named Hoang Van Duc, who had spent 3 years running ambushes against convoys and outposts across War Zone C before that spring, said something in a 1971 debriefing that his own commanders would never have allowed him to report while the war was still being fought. He said, "We had 30 men and the dark and the ground we knew. We had done this before to bigger units than 6 men. That night, the 6 men did not do what men are supposed to do when they know they are going to die. They called the artillery down on top of themselves." He was not describing a division-level battle. He was not describing Khe Sanh or the fall of a provincial capital. He was describing a single night, a rubber plantation the army called Quang Loi, and a reconnaissance team so small that most of his own regiment never learned it had a name at all. For decades, the story of American Rangers in Vietnam has been told almost entirely from the American side, through medal citations, through unit reunions, through documentaries built from the words of the men who survived to tell them. And in that telling, the small reconnaissance teams that became the lettered companies of the 75th Infantry Regiment occupy the place any elite unit occupies in its own history: skilled, disciplined, dangerous. But that telling explains a reputation without ever explaining the mechanism behind it. It does not ask the only question that actually matters, not from citation boards or after-action reports, but from the men who were moving through that plantation in the dark, expecting an easy kill. This is not a story about an American victory. Victory is the conclusion, not the subject. This is a story about what a Viet Cong squad leader admitted years later, about 6 hours he spent trying to kill 6 men who would not stay dead long enough to let him. To understand what the Viet Cong were reacting to that night, you need to understand what they expected. By the spring of 1969, the guerrilla forces operating out of War Zone C and the rubber plantations north of Saigon had been fighting American units for 4 years. They had developed, out of necessity, a precise taxonomy of the enemy. Regular infantry battalions moved loud, moved slow, and announced themselves with artillery preparation before they ever set foot in a free-fire zone. Armored cavalry was devastating in the open and nearly useless in the tree line. Air cavalry was fast and terrifying for exactly as long as the helicopters stayed overhead, and irrelevant the moment they left. Every American formation in the Viet Cong's operational experience had a signature, a noise, a rhythm, a pattern of approach that local guerrilla commanders learned to read the way a hunter reads weather. Then there were the small teams, 6 men, sometimes fewer, inserted by helicopter that touched down for seconds and was gone, moving without radios keyed except in emergency, without artillery preparation, without the noise of a column. They did not behave like soldiers who expected to be reinforced. They behaved like men who had already made peace with fighting alone. A Viet Cong district-level report circulated among local unit commanders in early 1969, the kind of internal bulletin used to brief village-level cadre on enemy activity, described these teams simply as the quiet ones, and instructed local forces to treat any unconfirmed sighting of a small American patrol as a probable ambush already in progress, rather than a target of opportunity. That distinction, probable ambush, not opportunity, is the entire difference between fear and confidence, and district cadre rarely wrote it down about anything American. What the Viet Cong did not fully understand, because it wasn't visible from the tree line, was that these teams were not an improvisation. They were the product of a deliberate institutional decision made at the highest levels of Army planning less than 4 months earlier. On February 1st, 1969, under an Army-wide reorganization called the Combat Arms Regimental System, every long-range reconnaissance patrol unit in Vietnam, the LRRPs that divisions had informally built and trained through years of trial and error, was formally redesignated as a lettered ranger company of the 75th Infantry Regiment. The Army did not choose that number arbitrarily. The 75th carried the lineage of the 5307th Composite Unit, the legendary long-range jungle raiders known as Merrill's Marauders, who had spent World War II doing precisely this kind of work against the Japanese in Burma. The message embedded in the redesignation was explicit. This was not a support function. This was a combat arm with its own institutional identity, its own standards, its own history to live up to. Selection was voluntary, and it was designed to fail most applicants before they ever reached a team. Company N, one of the ranger companies formed that spring, required a minimum general technical score of 100, screening out men who could not think quickly under compounding pressure. along with a clean physical and psychological bill of health, a personal interview with the unit's officers, and a probationary period of training patrols before a volunteer was accepted onto a permanent team. Many of the men selected as team leaders were sent afterward to the MACV Recondo School at Nha Trang, a 3-week, roughly 260-hour course established under General Westmoreland's direct order and run by the 5th Special Forces Group. The course did not end with a written exam. It ended with a live combat patrol into enemy territory, a graduation exercise veterans of the school remembered simply as the one you bet your life on. Men who failed that patrol did not graduate. Some did not come back at all. What this training produced was not a soldier who could follow a plan. It was a soldier who could operate for days with no plan beyond the next 100 meters, no expectation of rescue beyond what he and 5 other men could organize themselves, and no framework in which retreat was the default answer to contact. That distinction, a soldier built to decide alone, not a soldier built to wait for orders, is what the Viet Cong's district reports were circling without ever quite naming. On the night of May 11th, 1969, a 6-man team from Company Thurshan, 75th Infantry, 1st Infantry Division, was inserted near a rubber plantation outside a position the Army called Quang Loi. It was the kind of ground the district bulletin had described as belonging to the quiet ones. Within hours, nearly 30 Viet Cong fighters would find out what that actually meant. The helicopter touched down for 11 seconds. Sergeant Ormond B. Crabtree led 5 men off the skids and into the tree line before the rotor wash had finished flattening the grass, and by the time the aircraft was a fading sound over the plantation canopy, the team had already vanished into ground. The Viet Cong considered theirs to patrol unchallenged. Company 1, 75th Infantry, 1st Infantry Division, May 11th, 1969. The objective was reconnaissance. Confirm enemy movement near Quang Loi. Report positions. Avoid contact if possible. Contact, in the doctrine these men had been trained under, was not the goal. It was the failure state. What happened over the next several hours would prove that doctrine right in a way none of them wanted. Crabtree's team linked up in the dark with a second 6-man element already holding a static position. The 2 teams consolidating into a single perimeter roughly the size of a suburban backyard, 12 men total against whatever the plantation held. It began to rain, not a downpour, but the kind of steady drizzle that swallows sound and turns muzzle flash into a dull orange smear instead of a location. That was when the lights started. Hoang Van Duke, the squad leader whose later debriefing opened this account, had 30 men under his command that night, moving in loose formation through plantation rows his family had worked before the war made the land into something else. He did not know he was closing on 12 Americans. He knew only that his scouts had reported a small contact, smaller certainly than his own force, and that a small contact, in 3 years of running ambushes, had always meant an easy one. His men carried flashlights for exactly this kind of work, sweeping the dark for the telltale glint of an American rifle barrel or the pale flash of a face turned the wrong way. Crabtree's team watched nearly 30 of those lights converge on their position from 3 directions at once, swinging low across the mud, patient, unhurried, the movement of men who had done this before and expected to do it again before dawn. What Duke's men could not see, because it happened in whispers and hand signals under the rain, was that Crabtree had already gotten a radio call out. Weak, broken by the wet canopy and the low cloud ceiling, but enough. Artillery began walking rounds toward the plantation's edge, close enough that the concussion reached the American perimeter before the Viet Cong lights had finished closing. Then helicopter gunships came on station, engines audible even through the rain, their rotor noise doing what the flashlights could not, telling 30 men on the ground that this was not, in fact, an easy contact. Duke later said of that moment, in the same 1971 debriefing, "We heard the aircraft and we understood the size of the problem had changed. 6 men do not call helicopters unless 6 men believe 6 men are enough to matter. Daruta them." Then the sky did what it had been threatening to do since the insertion. The rain thickened into the kind of weather that pins helicopters to the ground, and one by one, the gunships peeled off station and left the 12 Americans exactly where they had started, outnumbered, in the open, in the dark, with the lights still closing, and no more air support coming until first light. With the gunships gone, Duke gave the order to close. 30 men against 12 was, by every calculation, his years in the plantation had taught him, not a fight, It was a formality, the kind of engagement that ended with an American radio going silent and a report filed the next morning about a patrol that failed to check in. He moved his men forward in 3 loose elements, the way he had moved them against smaller outposts before, expecting the pattern he had learned to trust. Initial contact, a ragged exchange of fire, and then the defenders either broke for the trees or died where they knelt. The Americans did neither. Crabtree had arranged his 12 men into overlapping fields of fire before the lights had ever closed the first 100 meters, and when the assault came, it came into a kill zone the team had been quietly building for the better part of an hour. The volume of fire that met Duke's lead element was, by his own later account, disproportionate to 12 men in a way his experience had not prepared him for. We had fought Americans in bunkers, Americans with tanks behind them, Americans who called artillery from 10 kilometers away and let the guns do the fighting, he said in the 1971 debriefing. These men had none of that anymore. The rain had taken the aircraft, and still they fired like men who believed help was still coming, when we were certain, that it was not. That certainty was itself the miscalculation. Because Crabtree's team was not fighting like men waiting for rescue. They were fighting like men who had already accepted that rescue might not arrive before dawn, and had decided that changed nothing about how the next several hours would go. When ammunition ran low along one flank of the perimeter, 2 Rangers redistributed magazines under fire, crawling between positions in the mud while rounds went past close enough to be heard rather than seen. When Duke's second element attempted to flank the position through a drainage depression that should have been the perimeter's blind spot, they found it was not blind at all. Someone had walked that ground before dark, memorized it, and left a man watching it in the rain for exactly this. The flanking element broke off and rejoined the main assault, and Duke, watching from the tree line, felt for the first time that night the sensation his debriefing would later describe with a phrase his interrogators found almost clinical in its precision. We began to understand that we were not attacking a position. We were attacking men who had already decided the position would not fall and had built everything around that decision hours before we arrived. The engagement went on past midnight in pulses, a surge of fire, a lull while both sides reloaded and listened, then another surge, each one slightly less coordinated on the Viet Cong side than the last, each one met by the same disciplined, economical response from the American perimeter. Duke lost men in the drainage depression, lost more to the interlocking fields of fire near the plantation's northern row, and by 2 in the morning had begun to make the calculation every guerrilla commander eventually has to make against a position that refuses to break. Whether 30 men and a dwindling window of darkness were still worth the cost of finishing what had started as an easy contact. By the time the sky over the plantation began to gray, Duke had made his decision, or thought he had. He would break contact before first light, before the American position could see well enough to make his withdrawal costly, and file the loss as the kind of bad luck engagement every unit absorbs and moves past. What he had not accounted for was that Crabtree had made a different calculation hours earlier, sometime in the dead middle of the night when the assault had stalled into its 3rd or 4th lull, that a defensive position, however well built, only wins a siege. It does not end one. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, with the rain finally thinning and the artillery batteries back within reach of his weak radio, Crabtree began quietly repositioning his own men, not to hold tighter, but to attack. At first light, 10 of Duke's men, exhausted from a night of failed assaults and the slow bleed of casualties in the drainage depression, were caught in the open by a coordinated ambush that came from a direction they had already written off as secured American ground. Crabtree had spent the last hour of darkness moving 2 men into that exact position while the rest of the perimeter kept up sporadic fire to hold the illusion of a static defense. When the ambush triggered, 6 of Duke's men went down in the first burst. The remaining 4 scattered and returned fire from whatever cover the rubber trees offered, and it was here, in the gray, uncertain light of a fight that should already have been over, that Crabtree left what little cover he had and moved directly toward the strongest remaining position himself. Duke, watching from a position further back, later described what happened next as the moment the night stopped making sense to him entirely. One man came forward alone, into fire, toward the position that still had the most guns, he said. In 3 years, I had watched men do many things under fire. I had not watched a man walk toward the loudest gun on purpose, as though walking toward danger were simply the next task in a list of tasks. Crabtree crawled the final distance to a concealed Viet Cong position and destroyed it with a grenade at close range, then moved again, under fire, alone, to a second position anchored around a machine gun that had been the source of most of the surviving element's fire, and silenced that one the same way. By the time the sun had fully cleared the tree line, what remained of Duke's 30 men were withdrawing in scattered groups through the plantation rows, leaving behind a position they had entered 8 hours earlier, believing it would fall within the first 20 minutes. Crabtree was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Bronze Star for that single night. Quang Van Duc, in the 1971 debriefing that forms the spine of the Viet Cong side of this account, was asked directly by his interrogators why a numerically superior force with the advantage of surprise had failed to overrun 6, then 12, exhausted men in 8 hours of continuous engagement. His answer was recorded exactly as he gave it, without elaboration from the officer taking the statement. "I do not have an answer that satisfies the question. We had every advantage a commander is taught to want. We lost anyway. I have thought about this for 2 years, and I still do not understand it completely." In the years after the war, as American military historians began compiling debriefings, unit histories, and interrogation records into a coherent picture of what had actually made these small reconnaissance teams effective, a strange pattern emerged, one that mirrored almost exactly the language Duke had used without realizing it. Analysts studying the 75th Infantry's combat record kept encountering the same structural anomaly Duke had struggled to articulate. These units did not simply survive contact at a higher rate than conventional infantry. They performed better the longer a fight went on and the worse their situation became, which is the inverse of how every textbook model of small unit combat predicts men should behave. A rifle company that loses radio contact, air support, and half its ammunition in the first hour of a night engagement is a rifle company that is supposed to break. Crabtree's team did not break. It counterattacked at dawn after 8 hours of exactly the conditions doctrine says should produce collapse. The answer was not classified, and it was not mysterious once you knew where to look. It was written directly into the training pipeline that had produced men like Crabtree 4 months before that night, specifically into the philosophy behind the MACV Recondo School's final exercise, the live combat patrol that instructors bluntly called the one you bet your life on. The school did not attempt to teach men to be fearless under fire. It attempted something more specific and, in hindsight, more effective. It exposed volunteers to the exact psychological experience of being outnumbered, isolated, and without the certainty of rescue, deliberately, under controlled but genuinely dangerous conditions, so that when the real version of that experience arrived in a rubber plantation at 2 in the morning, it was not a shock. It was a place they had already been. A Ranger Company commander who trained under that pipeline later described the effect in a post-war interview collected for a regimental oral history project. "We didn't train men to hope help was coming. We trained men to function as though it wasn't every single time, so that the night it actually wasn't coming changed nothing about how they fought." That distinction between a unit built to wait for rescue and a unit built to never structurally depend on it is the entire explanation for the bounty that opened this account. A guerrilla command that had absorbed years of contact with American firepower without pricing an individual soldier's head had done the arithmetic on these small teams and arrived at a number that admitted something no official communique ever would. That 6 men who did not calculate their odds the way soldiers were supposed to calculate them were more dangerous, engagement for engagement, than most of the machinery arrayed against them. Duke's own words, given 2 years after the war had moved past that single May night, come closest to naming the thing directly, even though he never quite manages it. "We had every advantage a commander is taught to want. We lost anyway." He is describing, without the vocabulary for it, exactly what the Recondo School had spent 3 weeks building into every man who graduated. Not the absence of fear, but the removal of the one calculation fear depends on. Quang Van Duc gave that 1971 debriefing, while still an active squad leader, still fighting, still years from the war's end. What his interrogators did not record, because it had not happened yet, was that Duke would survive the war entirely, return to the province his family had farmed for 2 generations, and live long enough to be asked about that night again, this time by a Vietnamese oral history project collecting veteran accounts in the early 1990s. 2 decades removed from the plantation and the rain and the 6 men who would not stay down. What he said in that later interview was not a correction of his wartime debriefing. It was an amendment to it, the kind a man only arrives at after enough years have passed for the immediate humiliation of losing to fade and something closer to genuine analysis to take its place. In 1971, I told the officers I did not have an answer that satisfied the question. Duke said, "I have had 20 more years to think about it, and I believe now that I was asking the wrong question entirely. I kept asking, why did 6 men, then 12 men, not break the way men are supposed to break when they are outnumbered and cut off and expect no rescue before morning? But that is not what happened that night. They did not fail to break. They had already decided, long before they ever got on that helicopter, that breaking was not an available option. The same way a man does not decide, in the middle of drowning, whether or not to breathe water. It was already settled. It had been settled somewhere else, weeks earlier, by people we never saw and never fought. We were only the ones who found out it was true. That distinction between men who simply didn't break and men for whom breaking had been engineered out of the equation before the first shot was ever fired is the whole of what this account has been circling since the bounty first appeared in Lanning's compiled interrogation records, $1,000, the same price as a colonel. Not because 6 men carried a colonel's rank or a colonel's authority, but because the Viet Cong command that set that number had done, in its own quiet way, the same arithmetic Duke would spend 20 years arriving at personally, that these teams could not be predicted, could not be pressured into the responses ordinary infantry gave under ordinary siege conditions, and could not be counted on to do the one thing an ambushing force always plans around: panic, retreat, or surrender once the odds became clear enough to see. They had found a way to build men who simply did not run that calculation, not recklessness. The record of that night is not a record of men fighting without thought, but of men fighting with total clarity about exactly how bad their position was and choosing repeatedly, hour after hour, to act as though the outcome were still theirs to decide. It was built deliberately in 3 weeks at Nha Trang on a live combat patrol men were told plainly might not end in their favor. It was built the same way, company by company, across the reconnaissance teams that would spend the rest of that war doing quietly, in the dark, in 2s and 6s, what entire battalions were built to do with tanks and artillery behind them. And on the morning of May the 12th, 1969, in a rubber plantation outside Quang Loi, a man named Quang Van Duc watched what that training looked like when it was finally tested against 30 men, the dark, and every advantage a commander is taught to want. He walked away from it with a debriefing he couldn't finish, and a question he would spend the next 2 decades answering for himself, one honest sentence at a time, until the price on a 6-man team's head finally made the kind of sense that no wartime report had ever been willing to admit out loud.